So first we will hear from Perla Saitz, who is the co-owner and program director of CHICLE Language Institute, where she oversees translation and interpretation services and is responsible for hiring and training all personnel. Today, Perla will talk about how CHICLE created a Spanish language proficiency assessment tool for Orange County that could be used across very diverse departments. Good morning, Perla.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's great to see the interest and effort from different organizations to provide quality language access to the LEP members of their communities. As part of the Hispanic community, I'm really grateful to see this effort from many organizations to make sure that communities that have problems with English receive the quality services they need and require. Well, today I'm going to talk about the Spanish assessment tool that CHICLE Language Institute created for Orange County. I'll start by giving you a brief overview on how the assessment works. Then I'll talk about how we went about creating it. Then we'll open up for questions and maybe talk about some of the lessons that we learned while creating this assessment. So first of all, let's talk about what is the Spanish proficiency assessment tool that we created. As we all know, when providing services in another language, sometimes staff is more willing than able. While we want to encourage their efforts, you are still responsible for their actions. So it's very important to have a system in place to make sure that people providing services in Spanish have the skills to do so. In 2006, Orange County came to us to help to find a way to evaluate the Spanish proficiency level of current and potential employees and volunteers. They were interested in an assessment that went beyond the traditional evaluation tools available at the time. They wanted an assessment that was tailored to the type of scenarios in which employees would use their Spanish, as opposed to just evaluating their general knowledge of Spanish grammar. So they also preferred a tool that could be administered by a staff member that we trained for them, instead of having to rely on someone external every time they wanted to evaluate someone. And that's how the Spanish proficiency assessment tool was created. So first, let me describe how this works. This Spanish assessment tool, or SPAT as we call it, is a standardized and objective methodology to assess the level of listening, speaking, writing, and translating skills of present and potential employees. So depending on their scores, employees are placed into 4 different groups according to their level. So group 1 are those whose Spanish is not really good enough to be used in their job. They may know a few phrases or words in Spanish, but not enough to interact with someone. Group 2 are for employees that can communicate minimally with clients or customers. They can ask that they wait until another employee comes to talk with them. They can give simple instructions and greetings, and they can make Spanish-speaking clients feel welcome, but they cannot provide actual services in Spanish. They just can say, one moment, please, I'm going to grab the interpreter, or take personal information so that someone else can contact that person later on, etc. So people who score high enough to be placed in group 3, those members are classified as adequate or proficient, they have grammar or pronunciation mistakes, but they can still provide many services in Spanish. So this means that they may not be using the subjunctive tense correctly, but they can do their job in Spanish and still provide a good service in the language. And finally, group 4 is people who are either bilingual native speakers or English speakers who are fluent in Spanish. So they will understand idiomatic Spanish that is spoken quickly. They barely have any grammar mistakes. The pronunciation is very good, etc. Okay, so let me show you a general overview of the different stages of the assessment. So first, in stage 1, there's a listening comprehension assessment where people listen to a recording and have to answer simple questions in English. If they pass this part, then they move to the speaking evaluation of this stage. For this section, the person is given simple pieces of information in English to say in Spanish. And if they don't score above the cutoff scores, then they're placed in group 1. In stage 2, we, again, speaking and listening comprehension are evaluated through screening instruments that are either department-specific or general simulated interviews. We wanted to evaluate if people were able to offer services in Spanish. So we created role plays that closely mimic real-life situations the employees may face in their interactions with clients. And this is the part that the county had a lot of interest in, not just to see if the person had general knowledge of Spanish, but if they could use, if they have the vocabulary necessary to use Spanish in their actual job and interactions with the clients. For example, if there's a nurse or a doctor, that they are actually able to provide services in Spanish and not just general conversation. So this part of the test works this way. The person taking the test has a form in English with a series of questions they need to ask in Spanish. The screener plays the role of the LEP person seeking services. He or she has to answer at a normal speed following a script that contains colloquial expressions people commonly use. The person taking the assessment needs to be able to understand these expressions or be able to clarify any information they didn't understand. This part of the assessment is recorded so the screener can score it at a later time. So listening comprehension is scored based on understanding of screener's responses to questions, and speaking abilities is scored based on the recorded interview. As I mentioned, we created specific scenarios that were requested for us based on the needs they identified. So the different role plays that the people use to test their Spanish are the child health, child protective services, social services, specifically a home visit, dental, emergency 911, emergency medical services, human rights, and a generic one for individuals in any department different from those above. So how did we go about to create these scenarios? To create these scenarios, we met several times with different county staff and directors to get feedback on the most common type of interactions they have with LEP clients in various departments. They also provided forms they commonly use because it was very important that these scenarios were as close to real life as possible. For that same reason, for the health-related and social services scenarios, we also used input from our interpreters that are familiar with the type of expressions clients use. Because typically, a Spanish speaker is not going to use textbook Spanish you learn in college. They use colloquial expressions. They use different words that are not what it's commonly taught in school. So that's why they wanted a tool that could help create these specific scenarios. Once the scenarios were completed, the Orange County Committee reviewed them to make sure they were as realistic as possible. So again, going back to how it works, depending on their scores, people were placed in groups either 2, 3, or 4. Only people placed in group 4 at a later time take a writing assessment and translation assessment. For the writing part, each group is asked to write a couple of paragraphs in Spanish describing her or his present job. And also, they're asked to translate a document related to health or social services, or a generic one talking about the county services. It is very important to have in mind that the fact that someone is a native speaker or are bilingual doesn't mean they have the skills to write original documents in Spanish or do translations. Oftentimes, there's a temptation to use bilingual staff to do translations or to write documents in Spanish, but they may not be qualified to do so because they may not be very good at spelling, or translation takes certain skills. So it's important to be aware of who you have writing these documents in Spanish or translating them. And it's always a very good idea to have someone review their work. So that's in a nutshell how this assessment tool works and how we created it.
Do you have any tips or lessons learned that you could share with folks here today who are looking to create a similar assessment tool, or maybe who want to revamp their current one?
Yes, one of the things that we realized, it's always a good idea to revisit the assessment to make sure it's still updated. At the beginning, when we created this tool, there was a cultural component to it, in the sense that they had 10 different questions about cultural things about the Hispanic community, but then we realized that those questions were not updated because data changes a lot. So we decided to eliminate that part. Also, it's important to make revisions as needed if you see something is not working quite the way it was planned. For example, for the writing assessment, we tweaked the instructions a little bit because originally it said write a paragraph or 2 about your current job and describe what you do. But some people would just write 2 or 3 sentences and that's it. So obviously, in 2 or 3 sentences that are very simple, you're not going to make a lot of mistakes, but it still doesn't mean you can write a complicated document in Spanish. So we had to change it to make sure that people wrote the amount of text that was enough to evaluate their ability. And also for when creating the scenarios, it's very important that you talk to the people that work in that situation to make sure what their needs are, what type of situations they face to create these scenarios as realistically as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Perla.